Intelligence Officer Rena Voss stood at the observation deck of the Galactic Council's diplomatic vessel, her reflection ghosting against the backdrop of Earth's gleaming surface below. The massive ship maintained its geosynchronous orbit above Geneva, where humanity's first official contact with the Council would soon take place. After decades of watching humanity from afar, the Council had finally deemed Earth ready for integration into the galactic community. Rena's enhanced neural implants registered a subtle shift in the atmosphere recyclers, a telltale sign that her alien colleague had entered the chamber. Ambassador Xyrix's crystalline form caught the starlight as they glided forward, their thought patterns manifesting as subtle pulses of bioluminescence beneath their transparent outer layer. The preliminary scans are complete, Xyrix communicated through the ship's translation matrix. We've detected no weapons signatures beyond expected defensive capabilities. However, something about the human delegate's psychological profiles concerns me. Rena turned from the window, her augmented eyes adjusting to focus on her colleague's ever-shifting form. Elaborate? Their responses during the preliminary communications show an unusual pattern. When presented with complex diplomatic protocols or challenging concepts, they simply state, "I understand," and continue forward. No species we've encountered has ever demonstrated such. Xyrix's crystals flickered with uncertainty, searching for the right word, composure. That sounds like a positive trait for diplomatic relations, Rena offered, though she noted the growing disquiet in Xyrix's oscillating patterns. Perhaps. Or perhaps it's something else entirely. The Council's xenopsychologists are detecting unusual brainwave patterns when humans use this phrase. It's as if they're not merely acknowledging information, they're processing it in a way we've never observed. Rena accessed her neural archives, reviewing footage from the preliminary communications. She watched as human delegate after human delegate responded to increasingly complex scenarios with the same calm, "I understand." No signs of stress, no indicators of confusion or overwhelming cognitive load. Just acceptance and continued engagement. Have you shared these findings with the Council? Not yet. I wanted your perspective first, given your expertise in first contact scenarios. Xyrix's crystalline structure emitted a soft hum of concern. There's something else. During our last communication, I presented the human delegation with deliberately contradictory information about our governance structure. They should have shown signs of cognitive distress trying to reconcile the paradox. And they simply said, "I understand," and proceeded to navigate the conversation as if the contradiction was perfectly natural. It's as if they've developed some kind of psychological defense mechanism that allows them to process incompatible information without experiencing the normal mental strain. Rena felt a chill run down her spine, a purely human reaction that her augmentations couldn't quite suppress. She had supervised 17 first contact scenarios in her career, but something about this situation felt different. The humans weren't just accepting new information, they were absorbing it in a way that defied the Council's understanding of cognitive processes. "We should delay the formal contact protocol," Xyrix suggested, their crystalline structure now pulsing with rapid patterns of concern. "At least until we can better understand this phenomenon." But Rena knew it was too late. The Council had already committed to the timeline, and humanity was expecting their arrival. More importantly, she recognized that this very conversation highlighted exactly why humans might have developed such a response. In a universe full of incomprehensible alien perspectives and paradoxical truths, perhaps, "I understand," wasn't just a phrase, it was humanity's way of maintaining sanity in the face of cosmic complexity. "No," she decided, her augmented voice steady. "We proceed as planned. But we'll need to modify our approach. Instead of testing their limits, we need to understand why they've evolved this capability. It could be the key to revolutionizing interspecies communication." Xyrix's crystals dimmed slightly, a sign of acquiescence. "And if we're wrong? If this trait proves to be more than just a diplomatic tool?" Rena turned back to the window, watching as the lights of human cities traced constellations across Earth's night side. then we may have just discovered something far more significant than a new member species. We may have found a civilization that's psychologically equipped to handle the true complexities of galactic society in ways we never imagined. As the ship's systems began the countdown to their scheduled descent, Rena couldn't shake the feeling that humanity's simple phrase, "I understand," might be the most sophisticated weapon they'd ever encountered. Not because of what it did to others, but because of what it allowed humans to endure. Diplomatic Crisis Coordinator James Blackwood had witnessed his fair share of interstellar incidents, but nothing could have prepared him for the scene unfolding in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council. The massive amphitheater, designed to accommodate representatives of over 300 species, had descended into chaos, if one could call absolute silence chaos. The hive mind collective of the Nexri, typically a constant buzz of synchronized thought patterns, had gone completely still. The crystalline meridians had frozen mid-oscillation, their usually flowing forms rigid with what their xenopsychologists would later describe as cognitive paralysis. Even the quantum-shifted vortex, known for existing in multiple probability states simultaneously, had collapsed into a singular, stunned manifestation. All because of what had just happened during humanity's first official address to the Council. The human ambassador, Thomas Reeves, stood calmly at the center of the chamber, seemingly unaware of the psychological devastation his words had caused. He had just finished responding to the Council's traditional test of new species, a deliberately impossible philosophical paradox designed to assess how potential members handled cognitive challenges. The test had been particularly brutal this time. The Council had presented a scenario involving quantum mechanics, temporal causality, and ethical decision-making that had been refined over millennia to be perfectly, elegantly unsolvable. Species typically responded with anything from intense philosophical debate to religious revelation. Some had even withdrawn their applications for membership. Reeves had simply listened, nodded, and said, "I understand." When pressed for elaboration, he had added only, "Yes, I see how that would be a problem," and proceeded to discuss trade regulations as if nothing extraordinary had happened. James watched from his observation pod as the Council's chief psychologist, a gaseous being named Vrathkar, attempted to process the implications. The psychologist's cloud-like form had condensed to nearly solid state, a sign of extreme cognitive stress. Permission to approach the human delegate, Vrathkar's translated voice whispered through the chamber's communication system. James knew what was coming. He'd seen it in the preliminary meetings, in every first contact scenario they'd handled so far. The aliens simply couldn't accept that humans could acknowledge paradoxes without trying to resolve them. "Ambassador Reeves," Vrathkar began, drifting closer, "you claim to understand the scenario we presented. Could you explain your understanding?" Reeves smiled, that disarming, peculiarly human expression that had already caused several minor diplomatic incidents with species who interpreted bared teeth as a death threat. "Of course. You presented a situation that cannot be resolved through conventional logic or ethics. I understand that. But, how do you continue to function with such knowledge? How do you maintain cognitive coherence while holding mutually exclusive truths in your consciousness?" "Well," Reeves shrugged, another gesture that had required weeks of diplomatic preparation to explain to the Council, "that's just how things are sometimes, isn't it?" James watched as ripples of what could only be described as psychological distress propagated through the assembled delegates. The human capacity to acknowledge paradox without attempting to resolve it was proving more devastating than any weapon their species had ever developed. In his private neural feed, James received an urgent message from Rena Voss: "We need to contain this. The Meridian delegation is showing signs of crystalline fracture from cognitive stress." James keyed in his response, "Recommendations? Get him off the floor. Now. Before he accidentally breaks more minds by being reasonable at them." But it was too late. Ambassador Reeves, noticing the distress among the delegates, was already speaking again, his voice carrying that terrible human empathy that made everything so much worse. "I understand your concern," he said, and James watched in horror as several more delegates showed signs of acute psychological trauma. "These are difficult concepts to process. Perhaps we should take a break. The suggestion of temporarily ceasing to engage with the paradox, rather than resolving it, caused the hive mind collective to emit a high-pitched tone that the translation matrix couldn't process. The Vorex representative split into 17 probability states, each one showing a different stage of existential crisis. As James initiated emergency diplomatic protocols, he couldn't help but wonder if humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology, or their adaptability, or even their resilience. Perhaps it was their capacity to look at the impossible, acknowledge it, and simply continue functioning. The real question was whether the rest of the galaxy could survive such radical acceptance. "Clear the chamber," he ordered through his neural link. "And someone get Ambassador Reeves a briefing on cognitive trauma protocols. Tell him to stop understanding things so openly. It's becoming a security risk." As the chamber emptied and emergency psychological support was dispatched to the affected delegates, James made a note in his report. Humanity's first day in the Galactic Council had lasted exactly 73 minutes before causing a diplomatic crisis. It had to be some kind of record. The worst part was, he understood exactly how it had happened. Dr. Ariana Torres had spent 15 years studying xenopsychology, but nothing in her research had prepared her for the data scrolling across her holographic displays. The patterns were impossible, or rather, they should have been impossible. The secure research facility beneath Geneva's Galactic Council embassy hummed with activity as her team processed the latest readings from their alien subjects. 3 weeks had passed since the infamous Council chamber incident, and the psychological aftershocks were still reverberating through the galactic community. Dr. Torres, her assistant, a quantum-networked AI named Aria, highlighted a particular dataset. "I've detected an anomaly in the Meridian Group's cognitive patterns." Ariana expanded the projection, her implants automatically translating the complex neural signatures into comprehensible visuals. What she saw made her breath catch. The crystalline being's thought patterns were changing. "Show me the comparison with last week's baseline," she requested, and a second set of patterns appeared alongside the first. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. The meridians were beginning to exhibit traces of human-like cognitive responses. "It's spreading," she whispered, more to herself than to Aria. "The ability to process paradox without resolution, it's not just a human trait anymore. They're learning it." A soft chime announced the arrival of First Contact Specialist Lieutenant Kai Patel, his uniform bearing the newly created insignia of the Human-Alien Psychological Integration Division. "Please tell me you have good news," he said, noting her concerned expression. Ariana gestured at the displays. "That depends on your definition of good. The meridians are developing human-style cognitive patterns. They're starting to exhibit our ability to acknowledge paradox without experiencing psychological distress. Isn't that what we wanted? Proof that other species can adapt to our way of thinking? In theory, yes. But the speed of the adaptation is unprecedented. And look at this." She pulled up another dataset, this one showing the neural patterns of the hive mind collective. "They're changing too, but differently. Instead of developing our ability to process paradox, they're creating new neural pathways to avoid processing it altogether. They see it coming and just skip over it." Kai moved closer to the displays, his cybernetic eye whirring as it captured and analyzed the data. "Are you saying they're developing psychological defense mechanisms against human thinking patterns? More like they're evolving in response to exposure to human cognition. Different species are adapting in different ways, but they're all changing. The question is, what happens when these changes reach critical mass?" The facility's warning system chose that moment to activate, bathing the laboratory in pulsing amber light. Aria's voice took on an urgent tone. "Doctor, we're detecting elevated psychological activity in all test subjects. The changes are accelerating." Across the lab, monitoring equipment began registering unprecedented levels of neural activity. The meridian subjects' crystalline forms were vibrating at frequencies that threatened to shatter their containment fields. The hive mind collective had split into individual units for the first time in recorded history. Even the quantum-shifted Vorax had stabilized into a single probability state, something that should have been physically impossible. What triggered this? Ariana demanded, her fingers flying over the holographic controls as she tried to stabilize the situation. Unknown, Arya responded. But I'm detecting a cascade effect. The changes in one species appear to be catalyzing changes in the others. It's as if their collective exposure to human cognitive patterns has reached some kind of tipping point. Kai was already activating his emergency protocols. I'm calling in containment teams. If this is what I think it is dash. Wait, Ariana interrupted, staring at a new pattern emerging in the data. Look at this. They're not just changing randomly. These patterns, they're harmonizing. Different species, different psychologies, all evolving towards some kind of convergence. The amber warning lights shifted to red as the facility's AI registered the magnitude of what was happening. Across the galaxy, reports were flooding in of similar phenomena. Species that had been exposed to human diplomatic missions were exhibiting unprecedented psychological changes. The ability to process paradox, or to avoid it altogether, was spreading like a cognitive virus. We need to contact the council, Kai said, his voice tight with urgency. This goes way beyond psychological contamination. We're looking at the potential evolution of galactic consciousness. Ariana couldn't take her eyes off the data streams. The patterns were beautiful in their complexity, terrifying in their implications. Humanity hadn't just introduced a new way of thinking to the galaxy, they had inadvertently triggered a fundamental change in how sentient beings processed reality itself. They're going to quarantine Earth, she realized, watching as the patterns continued to evolve. As soon as the Council understands what's happening, they'll try to contain it. Can they? Kai asked softly. Can you quarantine an idea? Especially one as fundamental as the ability to say, I understand, to the incomprehensible. Ariana thought of all the beings across the galaxy who had been exposed to human thinking patterns, of all the minds already beginning to change. No, she said finally. I don't think you can. The question isn't whether this change can be stopped. The question is, what are we all going to become when it's finished? The red warning lights continued to pulse as, throughout the facility, more and more alien subjects began to exhibit signs of cognitive evolution. And somewhere in the vast data streams of information flooding her displays, Ariana thought she could see the first glimpses of an answer that both thrilled and terrified her. The galaxy was learning to understand, and there would be no going back. The emergency session of the Galactic Council stretched into its fourth day as holographic representatives from across the galaxy debated humanity's impact on galactic consciousness. The chamber, designed to accommodate thousands of species, now held an atmosphere so tense it seemed to distort the very light of the artificial sun above. First Contact Specialist Kai Patel stood at the observation platform alongside Intelligence Officer Rena Voss, both watching as the latest speaker, a collective consciousness representing the archival minds of Sector 7, presented their findings. The cognitive alterations are now present in over 60% of known spacefaring species, the archivist's multi-layered voice resonated through the chamber. Our predictive models suggest complete saturation within 3 standard cycles. We are witnessing the largest psychological shift in galactic history. The chamber erupted into a cacophony of translated voices, neural signatures, and quantum fluctuations. Some delegates had begun manifesting multiple probability states simultaneously, a sign of extreme stress among certain species. Others had gone completely silent, their consciousness patterns indicating deep internal processing. They're afraid, Rena observed, her augmented eyes tracking the various stress indicators across the chamber. Not just of what's happening, but of how they're starting to understand it. Kai nodded, noting how the delegates' reactions seemed to split along evolutionary lines. The older species want quarantine. The younger ones want to study it. And the ones in between. He gestured to a group of crystalline beings whose forms were oscillating between states of matter. They're already changing too much to have a consistent opinion. High above the chamber floor, Dr. Ariana Torres's holographic form materialized beside them, her avatar flickering with barely contained urgency. We have a new development. The Hive Mind Collective, they've begun to fragment. Fragment? Rena's augments registered a spike of alarm. You mean they're dying? No, Ariana's hologram displayed a stream of real-time data. They're individualizing. The collective consciousness is voluntarily separating into distinct entities. They're choosing to understand reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Before they could process this information, the chamber's emergency protocols activated. A representative of the ancient Concordat, one of the oldest species in known space, had taken the floor. We have contained threats to galactic stability before, the ancient's voice carried the weight of eons. When the quantum plagues threatened to rewrite the laws of physics, we acted. When the time cascades risked unraveling causality itself, we intervened. This threat, this human cognitive pattern, is no different. We must isolate Earth and begin immediate psychological quarantine procedures. The chamber's atmosphere grew heavier as the ancient's words triggered cascading reactions among the delegates. Some species began exhibiting signs of agreement, their consciousness patterns aligning with the ancient's proposal. Others displayed patterns of resistance, their very forms shifting in protest. But it was the human ambassador, Thomas Reeves, who drew all attention as he calmly requested to speak. The chamber fell into that peculiar silence that seemed to follow human diplomatic interventions. Honorable delegates, he began, his voice carrying that dangerous reasonableness that had started this crisis. I understand your concerns. Several delegates immediately showed signs of psychological distress at the phrase. The ancient's form flickered with something that might have been irritation. But consider this, Reeves continued. You're not just seeing a threat. You're witnessing evolution in action. Every species here developed their unique way of processing reality through natural selection. Now, faced with the challenges of a truly interconnected galaxy, those processes are adapting again. The human speaks truth, a new voice joined the debate. A previously silent representative of the quantum architects, beings who existed partially outside normal spacetime, rose to address the chamber. We have observed similar patterns throughout galactic history. But never before has the catalyst been so elegant. A simple phrase, carrying the weight of infinite acceptance. The ancient's form pulsed with energy. You would risk the psychological stability of the entire galaxy for the sake of elegance. We risk more by resisting, the architect responded. Our observations of timeline potentials show that this change cannot be contained. The very act of understanding that it exists is enough to trigger the transformation. The more we try to quarantine it, the more it spreads through the attempt to understand why it needs quarantine. Kai watched as the debate unfolded, noting how the patterns of argument were themselves changing. Species that had never been able to comprehend each other's viewpoints were suddenly finding common ground, not in agreement, but in their ability to acknowledge and process their differences. It's not just about understanding anymore, he realized, speaking quietly to Rena and Ariana's hologram. It's about the capacity to hold multiple understandings simultaneously. We're not infecting them with our way of thinking, we're showing them how to think in ways they never imagined possible. The question remains, Rena replied, her augments tracking the spreading patterns of change through the chamber, whether the galaxy is ready for such rapid evolution. Understanding is one thing. Surviving what that understanding brings, that's something else entirely. Above them, the artificial sun flickered as the chamber's systems struggled to process the unprecedented levels of cognitive activity. The debate had moved beyond simple questions of quarantine and containment. The galaxy stood on the brink of a transformation that would redefine the very nature of consciousness itself. And at the center of it all, humanity's most powerful weapon continued to spread, the ability to look into the face of the impossible and simply say, I understand. The observation deck of the Galactic Council's diplomatic vessel offered a perfect view of the unprecedented gathering below. Ships from every known spacefaring civilization hung in high Earth orbit, their designs as varied as the species that created them. Dr. Ariana Torres stood alongside Rina Voss and Kai Patel, watching as the greatest assemblage of alien consciousness in galactic history prepared for what many were calling the convergence. "The latest readings are unlike anything we've ever seen," Ariana said, her eyes moving across streams of data only she could see. "The psychological changes have reached critical mass. Every species is exhibiting some form of cognitive evolution, but they're all evolving differently. It's like watching 1,000 parallel paths to the same destination." Rina's augmented vision captured the subtle energy signatures emanating from the gathered fleet. The ancient Concordat's ships are showing signs of quantum entanglement with the hive mind vessels. "That shouldn't be possible, their technologies operate on completely different principles." "It's not the technology that's changing," Kai observed, his cybernetic eye recording everything for posterity. "It's their understanding of each other. The ancients are beginning to comprehend the hive mind's perspective, and vice versa. They're not just communicating anymore, they're sharing consciousness." Below them, the space between the gathered ships began to shimmer with an effect that defied conventional physics. The quantum architects had described it as a manifestation of shared understanding, a physical representation of the psychological bridges being built between species. Ambassador Thomas Reeves joined them on the observation deck, his presence somehow both ordinary and extraordinary in the midst of such cosmic events. "The Council has reached a decision," he announced quietly. "They're ready to proceed with the interface." The interface, humanity's proposed solution to the crisis, was either brilliantly simple or simply impossible, depending on one's perspective. But in a galaxy where the very nature of understanding was evolving, perhaps those were the same thing. The plan was to create a controlled version of what was already happening naturally, a temporary linking of consciousness across all gathered species. Not to share thoughts or memories, but to share the experience of understanding itself. To show every being in the galaxy not just what humans meant when they said, "I understand," but what every other species meant when they processed reality in their own unique way. "Are we ready for this?" Ariana asked, though she knew the question was meaningless now. Ready or not, the change was happening. The only choice was whether to guide it or be swept along by it. "We don't have to be ready," Reeves replied with that characteristic human smile. "We just have to understand that we're not ready, and proceed anyway. That's what humans have always done." The shimmering between the ships intensified as the quantum architects began establishing the conscious interface. The Meridian's crystalline vessels refracted impossible colors across space. The hive mind ships pulsed with synchronized energy that linked them to their now individual components. Even the ancient Concordat's timeless vessels seemed to blur at the edges, their reality mixing with the space around them. "It's starting," Rina announced, her augments registering the first waves of the interface. Neural patterns are synchronizing across species barriers. The translation matrices are dash. She stopped speaking as the interface reached them. For a moment that contained eternity, every being in Earth orbit experienced a glimpse of how every other being understood reality. The ancients' eternal perspective merged with the hive mind's collective consciousness. The quantum architect's multidimensional awareness blended with the Meridian's crystalline thought patterns. And through it all wove humanity's unique gift, the ability to acknowledge, accept, and continue functioning in the face of such vast complexity. When the interface faded, the silence that filled space was different from any that had come before. It wasn't the silence of incomprehension or fear. It was the silence of billions of beings processing not just new information, but new ways of processing information itself. "Well," Reeves said finally, his voice carrying across the universal translation channel, "I understand." And for the first time, the phrase didn't cause psychological distress among the alien delegates. Instead, it triggered a cascade of responses, each species expressing understanding in their own way, yet each somehow harmonious with all the others. The ancients spoke of temporal comprehension. The hive mind hummed with collective awareness. The quantum architects shifted through probability states that encompassed all possible understandings simultaneously. Yet beneath the diversity of expression lay a unified truth: they did understand, each in their own way, and each way was valid. We didn't break the galaxy, Ariana realized, watching as new patterns of communication and consciousness began to emerge among the gathered species. We just showed it a new way to be whole. The observation deck's windows automatically tinted as Earth's sun emerged from behind the planet, its light playing across the assembled fleet. The ships were beginning to move, not away from each other, but into new configurations, patterns that reflected their newfound understanding of each other's perspectives. So what happens now? Kai asked, his cybernetic eye capturing the historic moment. Rena smiled, her augments detecting the birth of something unprecedented in the data streams between ships. Now we learn what understanding really means. Not just as humans, or as individual species, but as a galaxy discovering it can be more than the sum of its parts. Above Earth, the greatest gathering of alien consciousness in history began to disperse, but not in retreat or isolation. They moved outward carrying something new. Not just humanity's gift for accepting paradox, but every species' unique way of comprehending reality, all somehow made compatible through the simple recognition that understanding itself could take many forms. The galaxy would never be the same. But then, understanding something often meant accepting that change was not just inevitable, but necessary. And somehow, that made perfect sense.